In February 1959, a Soviet search team climbed a remote slope in the northern Ural Mountains and found a tent, half buried in snow, cut open from the inside. 9 sets of footprints led away from it, down the mountain, into the freezing dark. Some of those footprints belonged to people wearing only socks. Others were barefoot. None of them led back. What happened on that mountain in the hours after that tent was cut open remains one of the most examined and least understood deaths in modern history. The story begins in late January 1959 when a group of 10 experienced hikers set out from the city of Sverdlovsk in the Soviet Union on a skiing expedition into the northern Urals. Their goal was Gora Otorten, a distant peak whose name, in the language of the local Mansi people, is said to mean, "Don't go there." The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student and experienced outdoorsman, and the trip would later be named after him. Most of the hikers were students or recent graduates, all skilled skiers, all familiar with harsh winter conditions. This was not a group of amateurs. It was a graded expedition, a Category 3 trek, the most difficult classification in Soviet mountaineering at the time, and every member had prior wilderness experience. One member of the original 10, a man named Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to illness, a decision that would save his life. The remaining 9 continued on, 7 men and 2 women, all in their 20s, all trained, all prepared for the cold. They planned to reach Otorten, then return to Vizhai, the last inhabited settlement before the wilderness, by February 12th. They never arrived. When the group failed to check in on schedule, there was no immediate alarm. Delays were common on expeditions like this. But as days passed with no word, concern grew, and by February the 20th, a search and rescue operation was underway, involving volunteers, the military, and eventually aircraft. On February 26th, searchers found the group's tent on the slope of a mountain the Mansi people called Kholat Syakhl, translated by some as Dead Mountain, though this name predates the incident by generations. What they found inside and around it immediately raised questions that have never been fully answered. The tent was partially collapsed under snow, but still standing, still containing the group's belongings: boots, warm clothing, food. Nearly everything a group would need to survive a Ural winter night was left behind, undisturbed. And the tent itself had been cut open from the inside, not at the entrance, but through the fabric of the tent wall. Whatever drove 9 trained, prepared hikers to cut their way out of their own shelter, rather than exit through the door in temperatures far below freezing, happened quickly, and it happened without them stopping to dress for the cold. Footprints in the snow, some in socks, some barefoot, led away from the tent, down the slope, toward a forest roughly a mile and a half away. Searchers followed the trail. Under a large cedar tree at the forest's edge, they found the remains of a small fire, and nearby, the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko, dressed only in their underwear, despite the extreme cold. Investigators noted that the branches of the cedar tree had been broken up to a height, suggesting one of the men had climbed it, perhaps to look back toward the tent, or to spot something in the distance. 3 more bodies were found in the weeks that followed, scattered between the cedar tree and the tent, in positions suggesting they had died while trying to make their way back to shelter. Igor Dyatlov himself was among them, found gripping a small birch branch as though he had been climbing the slope back toward the camp when he died. The initial examinations showed these 5 had died primarily of hypothermia, though some had minor injuries consistent with a fall or a struggle through difficult terrain. The remaining 4 members of the group were not found until May, more than 2 months later, when the snow began to melt. Their bodies were discovered in a ravine, buried under several meters of snow, some distance from the others, and it was the condition of these 4 bodies that transformed the case from a tragic accident into an enduring mystery. 2 of the 4, Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov, had severe chest fractures, the kind of blunt force trauma more commonly associated with a high-speed car crash than a fall on foot. Another, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, had a fractured skull. Despite the severity of these internal injuries, none of the bodies showed corresponding external wounds, no bruising or breaks in the skin, consistent with a beating or an attack by another person. The medical examiner concluded the force involved was extremely high, but could not identify its source. Adding to the confusion, Dubinina's body was missing her tongue, eyes, part of the lips, and some facial tissue. Investigators at the time attributed this to decomposition and the effects of small scavenging animals during the months the bodies lay exposed, though this explanation has been debated by researchers ever since. Soviet investigators closed the case in May of 1959. Their official conclusion stated that the hikers died as a result of a compelling natural force, a vague and unusual phrasing that offered no specific explanation. The case files were sealed and access was restricted for decades, only becoming available for public research after the fall of the Soviet Union. That secrecy, more than any single piece of evidence, is part of why the case became so widely mythologized. A vague official explanation, combined with genuinely strange physical evidence, left enormous room for speculation. In the decades since, researchers have proposed a wide range of explanations, some grounded in established science, others far more speculative. One of the most enduring and scientifically supported theories involves a slab avalanche, a specific and less obvious type of snowslide that doesn't always leave the dramatic visual signature of a typical avalanche. Under this theory, developed further through research published as recently as 2021 by a team including Swiss and Russian scientists, wind-packed snow above the tent could have destabilized after the hikers cut into the slope to pitch their shelter, triggering a small, localized slab collapse. This could explain the traumatic chest and skull injuries consistent with the trauma seen in real avalanche victims, and would also explain why the hikers cut their way out of the tent in a panic rather than taking time to dress. Critics of this theory point out that the tent showed no evidence of the kind of snow burial or structural collapse typically caused by an avalanche, and question why the group would have made camp somewhere prone to a slide, given their experience. Another theory centers on infrasound sound waves below the range of human hearing that can be produced by strong wind interacting with certain rock formations, a phenomenon known as a Kármán vortex street. Some researchers have proposed that wind moving around the rounded shape of the mountain could have generated infrasound capable of inducing intense panic, disorientation, and physical discomfort in the campers, without leaving any physical trace afterward. This theory, popularized in part by author Donnie Icar's investigative research, offers a compelling explanation for sudden irrational panic, but remains difficult to test or confirm after the fact. Extreme cold itself has also been proposed as a factor, specifically a phenomenon called paradoxical undressing, a documented effect of severe hypothermia in which the body's temperature-regulating system fails, creating a false sensation of overwhelming heat that leads victims to remove their own clothing shortly before death. This could help explain why some of the hikers were found with minimal clothing, though it does not fully account for the traumatic injuries found on 4 of the victims. Then there are the theories that lean further from consensus science. Some point to reported sightings of unusual lights in the sky around the time of the incident, cited by several search parties and referenced in some official documents, and have suggested a connection to secret military testing in the region during the Cold War. Others have proposed encounters with local indigenous groups, though investigators at the time found no evidence connecting the Mansi people to the deaths, and this theory has been widely dismissed by researchers. In 2019, Russian authorities formally reopened an investigation into the case, driven largely by public and family pressure for a definitive answer more than 60 years later. In 2020, officials announced their conclusion. An avalanche, consistent with the slab avalanche theory developed by outside researchers, was the most likely cause of the incident, closing the case once again. Not everyone accepts this conclusion. Some relatives of the victims and independent researchers argue the reopened investigation still fails to explain every detail, particularly the tongue and eye injuries, and the specific pattern of the group's final movements. What remains undisputed is the sequence of choices made that night. 9 people who knew how to survive brutal winter conditions abandoned the relative safety of their tent in the dark, in extreme cold, without stopping to dress. Something made the inside of that tent feel more dangerous than the mountain itself. More than 60 years later, the Dyatlov Pass has become a place of pilgrimage for researchers, and the simply curious, a permanent memorial now marking the site where the group's story ended. The physical evidence has been studied more thoroughly than almost any other unexplained death in modern history, and still, no single explanation accounts for every detail without contradiction. 9 hikers set out to reach a mountain whose name warned them not to come. They never returned, and whatever happened inside that tent, in the final moments before 9 people chose the freezing dark over their own shelter, remains, even now, only partly understood.